Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nick. I'm the Communications Officer for the U Trust, and today we've got three people who are going to talk to us about Dragonfly. Dragonfly is a workshop that we offer, and I suppose it'll be a good idea to ask Andy, who's been around, I think, the longest. What is Dragonfly? Andy, please tell us who you are.
Hi, my name's Andy. I work for the U Trust. The Dragonfly Project is part of the U Trust. I've worked for the U Trust for about 5.5 years and been on the Dragonfly Project for about 4.5 years.
And what exactly is the Dragonfly Project?
Essentially, the project is about raising awareness around domestic abuse, its impact, and how people can help, particularly targeting rural and isolated communities. There's a report that came out in 2014 that looked at domestic violence and abuse in isolated communities and found that people suffer much longer in isolated and rural communities than they do in urban communities. Initially, I looked at femicides in each police area across England and Wales. And femicides is deaths of a woman at the hands of a man. And found that Dorset had the third highest rate of femicides across England and Wales. And all the top areas were rural areas. So began a study and began looking at how we can help people in rural areas and bring that crime rate down, that murder rate down.
And I know that during COVID, a lot of the workshops, of course, actually, if not all of the workshops were online. How do the workshops and how are they offered now?
Currently, workshops are offered online or face-to-face. We can do it as clients want to, really. We can bespoke and tailor the workshops as clients want to.
And as you mentioned, femicides in rural areas have a higher frequency of taking place. And that's, of course, what Dragonfly is about. So what exactly does Dragonfly do in order to tackle that? I suppose I can pick on someone else now. How about you, Alison? What exactly does, in a Dragonfly workshop, what do you teach people to help with problems like this?
Well, the aim of the workshop really is to increase people's understanding of what domestic abuse looks like, how that they can respond to a disclosure, how they can recognise an abusive situation, and really how they can help. It's really about increasing their awareness and understanding of how they can help. And of course, once they've done the workshop, they then are Dragonfly champions and they're able to contact the Dragonfly team. They're able to make referrals. They're able to contact us and say, well, we're not quite sure about this. I don't know how to go about this. What do you think? And we just respond to the emails, or we have telephone conversations with them. And very often that results in a referral. And of course, all the people that they refer in would have gone under the radar because they weren't accessing support. So our Dragonfly champions are really important to us. All my entire caseload comes from the Dragonfly champions in Hampshire.
And you've had quite a few workshops and participants over the past year or two, haven't you?
Yes, we have. We were looking at the figures recently since it started in 2017, and it's really gathered pace. Would you agree with that, Andy? It's gathered pace over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, it has done. Yeah.
And we've had 3,500 champions. Well, we've got 3,500 champions.
And of course, as you said, that they then spread that sort of word, don't they?
Yeah, they do. They're great.
And I mean, that's 3,500 people. So just jumping over to you, Charlotte, what sort of demographics are we talking about? If you look at a particular workshop, sort of a ball figure, is it half men, half women, or is the dynamic very different to that?
Of people that join the workshop?
Yeah, I mean, do you see predominantly women in the workshop, or is it predominantly men? What's the sort of balance?
I think it's definitely I would, as long as Alison and Andy kind of agree, I would say it's more women that do join ultimately, but we do have a lot of men. People out in the community that we target can be anyone from hairdressers, beauty salons, to the same as people that work in the banks, doctor surgeries, schools, any people in the community that might possibly come across a disclosure. So there sometimes are certain professions. I definitely have a face-to-face one lined up with a doctor surgery. That was actually quite predominantly male in that case, but yeah, sometimes we have things, you know, charities as well, which can be women led, so that there can be more women in that sense. Definitely.
You mentioned it just now, Alison, that it sort of seems to be growing a bit more. Would you maybe agree that it's also growing in the sort of the sort of genders as well? Would you say it's a few more men now than there were 5 years ago when it started?
Yes, definitely a few more people doing it now than there were when it started. I think word of mouth has a lot to do with that. People's experiences, people recommending it. We get lots of really positive feedback, and then they go on and share that with their colleagues or their friends.
Yeah, and that's of course one of the big things is word of mouth in spreading that. So of course, to each person it's going to mean something different, isn't it? Any particular job that you do. So jumping back to you, Andy, what exactly does it mean for you as a male teaching the world, or teaching, sorry, workshops about domestic abuse?
I think it's important really that there are men in this industry, that there are positive role models for women and particularly children that have fled an abusive relationship, but there is positive role models that men aren't all the same. It's important to me to educate people that domestic abuse isn't just about violence and women being hit. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more complex than that. It's a lot more subtle than that as well. And domestic abuse can affect anybody and does affect anybody and everybody in some way. You know, we would all know somebody that's been affected by domestic abuse. And it's important that we know how to respond.
Now, you mentioned a very important part there that I wouldn't mind unpacking just a little bit. Maybe I can ask you, Charlotte, over here. Now, Andy mentioned that domestic abuse isn't just necessarily physical. What other ways can it manifest?
Yeah, and that's, you know, something that's really important about the workshop. Again, coming back to one of its main targets is about dispelling myths around domestic abuse, and that's definitely one of the big ones. That oh, they haven't hit me, so it's not domestic abuse. That's definitely a big myth. Coercive control came out in December 2015, so only newly kind of recognised that the impacts are absolutely, you know, massive for victims. It can affect every facet of their life. The important things about coercive control is that it's about their everyday living, that limiting their everyday living. And like Andy said, it can be really, really subtle and quite a drip feed process that often victims don't recognise. To start with, it can take a really long time. And in the workshop, we do describe how victims often feel like a hostage within their own home.
Now, you mentioned a very important part there that I wouldn't mind unpacking just a little bit. Maybe I can ask you, Charlotte, over here. Now, Andy mentioned that domestic abuse isn't just necessarily physical. What other ways can it manifest?
Yeah, and that's, you know, something that's really important about the workshop. Again, coming back to one of its main targets is about dispelling myths around domestic abuse, and that's definitely one of the big ones. That oh, they haven't hit me, so it's not domestic abuse. That's definitely a big myth. Coercive control came out in December 2015, so only newly kind of recognised that the impacts are absolutely, you know, massive for victims. It can affect every facet of their life. The important things about coercive control is that it's about their everyday living, that limiting their everyday living. And like Andy said, it can be really, really subtle and quite a drip feed process that often victims don't recognise. To start with, it can take a really long time. And in the workshop, we do describe how victims often feel like a hostage within their own home.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that, as someone who's only been in the trust for 2 years now, that I'm learning a lot more from too, because I was outside of this particular sort of industry, not industry, but sphere. A lot of people do just think, oh, it's physical. That's what domestic abuse is. But I think, as you say, in recent times, in particular, with new laws that have been coming in, like stalking, that's been brought up a lot now. That is criminal. As you mentioned, coercion. Like you said, 2015, it actually became was actually illegal, termed what exactly happened in 2015? It became
absolutely. It came into the legal system. You can either have a fine or up to 5 years in prison or both. So it does carry a lot. But Andy has some quite good statistics, unfortunately, around how many people actually get prosecuted for that.
Something like in 2020, something like 34,000 cases of coercive control were reported to the police, but only about 1,200 prosecutions. So there's a huge discrepancy between the amount of offences reported to the prosecutions that are made. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done to help victims get justice.
And out of those prosecutions, there are not a huge number of convictions, are there?
No, because some of them are still going on. So we don't have accurate stats for the amount of convictions, because some of them go on for many years, to be honest. So some of them are still ongoing. So we won't have the actual number of convictions for a while.
And why do you think there is this sort of very slow, and if it even gets into the system, why do you think that is, Alison? I mean, what's the reason that is stopping the prosecutions from going through? Is it because people aren't trained or people don't know?
I think that I'm not sure that this is actually going to answer your question, but one of the reasons I'm really passionate about the Dragonfly Project is before I was working on the Dragonfly Project, I was working as a children and young persons domestic abuse advocate. And I had a case where the mother and her children were really seriously abused, and the perpetrator of the abuse, he was charged with 9 different counts, and one of them was coercive controlling behaviour, which is quite difficult to get a conviction on. The 2 girls, the teenagers that went to court and gave evidence, they were absolutely terrified, and the judge very kindly let me sit next to them in the witness box to give I wasn't allowed to speak to them, I wasn't allowed to communicate with them, I was there just for emotional support. We were behind a curtain, so that the perpetrator, the man in the dock, couldn't see. So I sat and listened to the evidence firsthand. It was horrendous what he had done, the physical abuse, the photographic evidence of what he'd done, and his justification for doing that. I was quite, I couldn't believe it. He was justifying his actions. He actually got found not guilty on all 9 counts.
And I mean, how is that possible if there's actual evidence? Is there, because there's loopholes in the system, or?
It was about the jury, whether they believed him or whether they didn't. I came away really, really frustrated, and I carried this with me for quite some time. And I met the Deputy Crown Prosecutor for Wessex Crown Prosecution Service, and I had a proper whinge to her about it, because it was about 6 months later, and I said to her, the jury didn't understand. What the jury needs educating. And she said to me, Alison, we can't influence the jury, so we can't teach them before they go in on jury service. Well, when the opportunity came up to take on this role, I thought, of all those 3,500 people that we have trained over the years, they're all potential jurors. And I thought, I'm getting in there. And the other thing she said to me was, soaps are really good at running storylines with things like domestic abuse. Now, sorry for everybody who likes soaps, I've always poo-pooed soaps because there's so much arguing going on, and I for whatever reason, anyway, it doesn't matter why I've poo-pooed them, but I have. Okay. And she said those soap stories, they educate people as well. And she said to me, there's something going on Coronation Street at the moment. So I started watching Coronation Street to see this storyline unravel. They did a fantastic job. And for the first time in my entire life, I could see a purpose in a soap.
Actually, this does bring us down to another rabbit hole that I'll go in a moment. But I want to jump down to Charlotte first, because you got your hand raised. Go ahead, Charlotte.
Yeah, no, I definitely just kind of wanted to second what Alison's talking about there, because I definitely think taking part in the Dragonfly workshop, you know, similarly means a lot to me because of the power of awareness and education. Prevalence rates for domestic abuse are still so shockingly high, you know, with an estimated 2 women a week murdered in the UK. And I do believe we need to tackle domestic violence through many different lenses, you know, looking at perpetrator behavioural intervention, working and supporting victims and survivors, but also, you know, mainly educating and having that overall shift in societal attitudes being just as important. You know, individuals' belief systems, morals, values are often formed by culture, which is influenced by things like the media, like what Alison was talking about there, and our primary and secondary socialisation process, so what we're taught growing up and our influences in our childhood, but also our laws and our criminal justice system, which state what is wrong and right behaviour. And I think, like we've spoken about a little bit in the workshop, we do actually touch on domestic violence legislation and looking at quite a lot of the positive changes. But, you know, Nick, did you know that marriage wasn't illegal in the UK? Rape within marriage wasn't illegal in the UK until 1991.
I did not know that, no.
No, so, you know, it was only 31 years ago roughly, and that's kind of derived from the notion that there is that degree of ownership over your partner. But we have come obviously quite far from that, and we have had many positive law changes. But messages that we receive growing up around healthy relationships, whether that be through family or institutional education or other influences like the media, are so important. So just like the workshop we deliver, which aims to dispel those myths around domestic abuse and really highlighting the reality for victims to try and remove that victim blaming stance. You know, we often say in the workshop, oh, the infamous question of why doesn't she leave, but rather why doesn't he or she change, or why does he or she think their behaviour is acceptable? You know, where is this belief system for that perpetrator coming from?
Charlotte, you made a very good, you raised a very good point there. Obviously, Alison doesn't like her soap piece very much, but as you say, a societal lens it's extremely important. What society is, I suppose, taught is appropriate or isn't appropriate. Now, I mentioned this a couple of months ago when Happy Valley, which was a very popular show on BBC, came out, and within that, there are a couple of scenes which should play out incorrectly as far as the police and what they should be doing, as far as how they should be intervening and helping. And obviously that then, you know, to other people it seems, oh, okay, that's okay then, and it doesn't really help out people who are stuck in that situation. So just looking at the workshops, when you do give these workshops, let me go over to you, Andy. How do you train people? Let's, as Charlotte mentioned, you know, it could be a hairdresser, it could be a nurse, it could be a doctor. How do you sort of not convince them, but how do you give them the tools to be able to intervene and signpost people?
We demonstrate what domestic abuse is. We look at the different types of domestic abuse that there is. We look at 5 different types of domestic abuse. We do show real case studies that we talk about. We do demonstrate what the different behaviours are associated with those types of abuse. So we show people what abuse is, what it looks like, how it impacts people, how it affects people's lives, how it can affect victims' decision making, because they're not always aware of what domestic abuse is. We demonstrate how to spot warning signs, how to spot warning signs of what a domestic abusive relationship might be. And then we go on to demonstrate how they can help, where they can get help, what kind of questions they can ask, how they can approach victims, or how they can allow victims to approach them in a non-threatening way. We'll always reinforce that you always believe when a victim first makes a disclosure, always believe what they say, and then show where they can signpost with help, and how those are the tools that we put in place.
And I'm assuming that you don't. It's an interesting thing. I saw something on social media recently. I think it's from an organization that basically encourages people to intervene if they see a situation unrolling. Is that something that you teach in the workshop? Because of course there's a lot of controversy around that kind of approach. From what I've read, the studies say you shouldn't do that. In what way can people approach that you train?
We would not recommend that they intervene. If you intervene in a situation that you see, that victim's got to go home with that person. You can't protect them then. You don't know what's going to happen behind closed doors. So we don't recommend that you intervene necessarily. We give people badges, very much like the logo that we've got behind us. That tells people that they're a Dragonfly champion. There's various social media promotions that explain what a Dragonfly is. When people see the logo, they know that it's a safe person to talk to, and they can talk to that person in a safe manner without being threatened.
I
Excellent.
would absolutely agree with Andy about not intervening, and you do increase the risk of that victim, and you put yourself at risk. So that's not a good idea either. But it's about finding a time to talk to that person away from the person that's causing them harm. And there are lots of ways of doing that. And if somebody phoned us up and said, "Hey Andy, hey Charlotte, hey Alison, what do we do? We've seen this going on." Well, we would then talk to them about that specific situation and be able to help to guide them how to find time to talk to them discreetly. Because, of course, this person may not want help.
And not ready to accept it as well. I think, the biggest thing is just making sure that person is aware that you are an okay person to talk to as and when they want to, at their own pace and at their own journey. It's something that we also make quite clear in the workshop, that we're not there to dictate to victims. We would, even if they do accept our support, we don't tell them what they should or shouldn't do. They've got someone else doing that. We're just there to lay out their options, give them informed choices, and if they want to explore that, we can help do that. If it's someone that it's just about asking the right questions and making sure you ask more than once, but not pushing it, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And just going on from what Charlotte says, part of our role is empowering our clients to make informed choices for themselves. Not to be dependent on somebody else, for example, not become dependent on support workers, but to empower them to make independent choices and the right choices for their lives.
Some of the clients, we all carry a caseload of clients as well as running these workshops, and some of our clients will live with the person causing them harm, and some will be leaving, some will have left. They're all at various stages on their journey, but we will never tell a client they have to leave. The person causing harm is telling that person what to do day in, day out, what cereal they can eat, whether they can go to the shop and buy any bread. It can be as small as that. Okay, and it may sound trivial, but it's not. If you can't ever choose what you have for breakfast, that's something we will take for granted. But they have got someone dictating to them how they live their life 24/7. They do not need another person coming in saying, "Well, you must, you must, you must." We say, "Well, these are your options. This is what you could do." And then we look at supporting them with their decisions that they make. And another thing, if we for want of a better word, persuaded somebody to leave, the chances are they would go back. And once they've left and go back, that perpetrator knows that they've got the resources to leave, so they will up their ante and they'll be more at risk. So it's a fatal mistake to make.
Part of our roles is definitely working with the victim to help recognize that abuse and to make them realize it's not their fault, because that coercion can be so strong. They're not going to sometimes know, and that's another area that we cover, kind of the cycle of abuse during the workshop. But we can also use that with victims to help them understand what's happening in their own lives, which can sometimes lead to the decision to leave because they want to, because they recognize it's abusive and it's not their fault, even though they've been told time and time again that it is.
As I say, and each situation is unique. People tend to tar relationships as abusive and lump it into one, but each situation's unique and each relationship's unique, and we treat all our clients in a person-centered and unique way, and work in a way that's good for them and right for them and their situation. As I say, and each situation is unique. People tend to tar relationships as abusive and lump it into one, but each situation's unique and each relationship's unique, and we treat all our clients in a person-centered and unique way, and work in a way that's good for them and right for them and their situation.
And Just before we come to the end of this, just to ask each of you to think about what's the biggest question, the most asked questions that you get from a workshop, because I'm sure you're dealing with people from very different backgrounds. As Charlotte mentioned, you could be a nurse, you could be a hairdresser or a spa person. Are there any, not trends, but are there any common questions that you're surprised people ask?
I think for me, people are surprised that we don't tell people to leave, that
Okay.
we're not more directive, that we are led by the client, and we do empower the client. I think people are slightly surprised at that.
I think the feedback's always quite similar. It's always very informative, and we always get really, really nice things said, especially from possibly even domestic violence survivors, and they're really thankful for the work that we're doing. And I definitely find that. I run one of the support groups at my organisation, working with survivors of domestic abuse, and they always say, not always, like Andy just said, every situation is so unique and specific to that victim, but quite often they got into those relationships quite young. Again, coming back to that educational point of view of just having people that are raising awareness and having those conversations that domestic abuse isn't okay, to prevent maybe some people, but also to help others that are still currently in that situation.
So just going on from what Charlotte says, part of our role is empowering our clients to make informed choices for themselves, not to be dependent on somebody else, for example, not become dependent on support workers, but to empower them to make independent choices and the right choices for their lives. If anyone is affected by domestic abuse, feel free to contact Paragon at any time.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody.